Close the door, Francois. Make it easier to. Welcome, everybody. We'll get started. I'd like to extend a warm welcome on behalf of Chairman Roger Wicker and the entire commission for joining us this afternoon for a talk with one of our former colleagues, Knox Thames, on a matter that is really one that the commission is known for really highlighting the importance of the moral dimension of foreign affairs. Commission, it's been almost 50 years that we've been doing that, and some of the matters that I think our commissioners have had the most success on and really kind of developed a brand is maybe not the right word, but a legacy, if you will, religious freedom. First and foremost. Back in the 70s, immediately after the creation of the commission, one of the human rights matters of the day was the freedom of Jewish refuseniks in the Soviet Union their protest started as just a matter of being able to bake matzah for Passover, and ended with really the rallying cry, "Let my people go." And the commission worked throughout the 80s on family reunification, helped stand up institutions like the Commission on International Religious Freedom, helped our commissioners were lead drafters in things like the IRF Act, and also, of course, trafficking in persons, Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, human rights sanctions. But before turning it over to my colleague Bhakti, who covers religious freedom now at the Commission, I'd like to just say a few words about my friend, my former colleague, and a mentor, Knox Thames. So I started the Commission in 2006, which is 19 years ago, and I thought I was there to be a Russia area studies guy, and I was setting up my desk that first week, and Knox was about the business. He had seen a story of a human rights, or a dissident in Turkmenistan, which in those days and still sadly today is really one of the most authoritarian countries in the world. And this was the days of the Saparmurat Niyazov, who proclaimed himself the father of the Turkmen, president for life, renamed the days of the week, the months of the year, and so this individual had written a letter, just I think asking for permission to hold a political meeting, and for that he was arrested and sent to a psychiatric hospital. Of course, there's a real dark legacy in the Soviet Union of the sort of abuse of psychiatric hospitals to punish dissent. And so Knox had discovered his case and decided that he would whip up a letter, and had our interns walking up and down the hallways and gathered, I think, well over 50 signatories. And I was kind of watching this my first week there, and I came in a couple days later and opened up the computer to the news that this gentleman had been released. And I have this, I pulled the piece up today when I was just preparing here. Just quote two passages of it. Durdikuliev, here I get the same treatment members of Congress get when you try to pronounce these names, also is thanking those that he credits for helping obtain his release, particularly 54 members of the U.S. Congress who sent a letter to President Niyazov earlier this month calling for his release. I want, through your radio, to say thank you very much to international organizations of the U.S. Congress, Durdikuliev said, and also the many people who sent telegrams, postcards, letters to me, 40 or 50 of them, showed them to me once. but they are still kept by the head of the psychiatric hospital. I want to thank them. We've heard, and this is Knox's good work, and we've heard over and over from friends, you get to know in this business who have become political prisoners of how important it is that they're remembered in letters, and you're seeing it there. But that was a real moment for me in my own career, and a lesson that the commission is a lot more than just a repository of regional expertise, which it is, or thematic expertise, which of course we have, but that we're called to be advocates. And Knox, just a word, Knox's impressive bio is out there, and I hope you've had a chance to pick that up as well as a recent, I think, excerpt from your book, and also a tribute to Knox's predecessor, the Commission's first Council for International Religious Freedom, Karen Lord, and that's also out there, and I commend to your reading. But I just want to read Knox's tribute here, because I think, just as I look to Knox and help set me on the straight and narrow in the ways of human rights advocacy from an area studies guy, Karen, I think, really clearly made a mark on Knox, and was one of the first people who, really helped put religious freedom on the U.S. foreign affairs agenda. Karen Lord is the reason I became involved in international religious freedom advocacy almost 20 years ago. As far as I'm aware, she was the first civil servant to work full-time on international religious freedom issues for a U.S. government agency. She was a forerunner to all the various offices and positions that exist today, both within the U.S. government, within the OSCE. While in law school, I was connected to her through mutual friends who knew I was attending the same D.C. law school she attended some years before. She encouraged me to apply for an internship at the Helsinki Commission to work with her, which was my first exposure to these issues. Almost 20 years later, I've committed my career to this work that she pioneered, Knox Thames. So I just thank you, Knox, and I appreciate the opportunity myself, just as I was, kind of getting up this morning and taking the metro in to go back and sample a little bit of the rich legacy, thanks to you and Karen and the work of our commissioners on a bipartisan, bicameral basis to kind of place this matter, before heads of state, before top policymakers, and an opportunity for us even at the commission now to refocus our efforts and to rededicate ourselves to this just cause. So with that, thank you, Knox. Over to you, Bhakti.
Kyle, thank you so much. Kyle Parker is Chief of Staff at the Commission, and thank you so much for the introduction. My introduction, both because Kyle covered some of the things that I would want to talk about. I was at a barbecue this week, and I was talking. By the way, there was no pool party, and that's a public service announcement. Do not go July barbecues without pool. And we were there, and we were talking about work, and one of my friends said, "So what are you working on these days?" And I said, "Well, next week I'm going to have a briefing on religious freedom." And she laughed and she said, "Is this some sort of historic overview of things? I mean, what is going on?" If you live in contemporary America, if you are the average American, obviously this group is not, because you are here today to talk about this, to hear about this. That's what you think. You think that religious persecution is something that happened decades, centuries ago, and it does not have an impact on day-to-day lives of today of people across the world. And it's absolutely not true. The best data we have says that 380 million Christians face persecution on a daily basis. And this is the best data we have. And obviously this is Christians alone, and we're talking about other groups as well, Muslims, Jewish people, Jews. What we see in Syria, what we saw in Syria is horror and ugliness. We have members of Jehovah's Witnesses here whose members in Russia face daily persecution, who because of their beliefs are thrown into jail, and they are there, and they face torture, they face harsh treatment. So it is a reality for millions across the world. This is why we're having this briefing today, because we want to talk about this, and we don't want to forget about the people who are suffering on a daily basis. This is not confined. Obviously, people know about, people who might hear something about, they know about North Korea, they know about Russia, they know about Xinjiang in China, but it's not just limited to those states. Even democracies are susceptible to this. Places like India, for example, where minorities face daily persecution, where their lives are at stake literally for their beliefs. This freedom of religion is a core American value. We're talking about it not just because it's a core American value, but because it really is the stabilizer. It's the thing, the foundation upon which every other thing is built. In the first Trump administration, I'm going to read here, it was set as a global priority, as an American priority for global security, and we called it, the administration called it the foundation of a healthy, democratic world. So it is a foundation. It's the first, in 2019, there was a ministerial of advanced religious freedom, and that's what was said. So I do apologize. I'm so loud that I didn't know that if my microphone is on or not. So the reason why we're doing it today, 6 months into this administration, more than that, where does religious freedom, where does this agenda stand? What is going on in the world? What are the strategies that we can employ that are successful, that have not been successful, that we can use to advance this cause? And there's no one better. I mean, if you've been to one of these briefings, you always know there are multiple witnesses, but on this topic, we only have one, because he is the architect of the contemporary architecture for defending religious freedom. Knox, Kyle talked about him, but I'm just gonna read off a couple of things. He was a special advisor for religious minorities at the State Department under both Presidents Obama and Trump. He worked at USARF, it's a commission on international religious freedom, and he's now a senior fellow at Pepperdine and a senior visiting expert at U.S. Institute for Peace. And he has an amazing book that if you care about this topic, if you think about it, you should definitely look it up. It's called Ending Persecution, Charting the Path to Global Religious Freedom. So today, we want to open this up with your presentation. Then I have a couple of questions that I'm generally interested in. The man is a legend, so I do have questions. And then what we're going to do, we're going to open it up to the audience. And there's a microphone. I would encourage you, whatever questions you might have, please come up, ask those questions, because this is that opportunity to do that. So anyway, please, Knox.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Kyle and Bhakti, for that very generous introduction. Just sort of the bottom line up front for what I want to focus on today is the United States is uniquely positioned among countries around the world to be a force for good, to defend the rights of people to believe whatever they want, to defend those who are persecuted for their beliefs in ways that no other country can. It's in our interest to do this because countries that respect religious freedom are more stable, more peaceful, more prosperous, less likely to be at war with themselves or their neighbors. And it reflects our values, that religious freedom is that core part of the American story, the American experience. And we represent ourselves better when we incorporate this into our foreign policy. So I'll be, just in my brief overview remarks, hitting some of the highlights from my book that Bhakti referenced, Ending Persecution. I'll talk about the 4 different types of persecution and 4 things that the United States can do. And I think, knowing we've got Hill staffers here, there's some really unique opportunities that you can do with your bosses to be a voice yourself and also challenge the United States to carry this forward. Religious freedom, religion is a global trend. The Pew Research Center has some fabulous statistics that say that roughly 85% of the world believes in God or a higher power, that believes in something beyond themselves that gives their life purpose, meaning, and direction. At the same time, they found consistently that roughly 2 out of 3 people on earth live in environments that restrict the free practice of faith. 2 out of 3 people live in environments where they're susceptible to persecution. They're not actively being persecuted, but if they challenge the status quo, if they want to change lanes, if they want to question the way that they're traveling, or they want to get on a completely different highway, they face prosecution by their government or persecution by their neighbors or both. So you take these very high levels of religiosity combined with high levels of restrictions on the free practice of faith, and this is a recipe for instability and human rights and suffering on a massive, massive scale. So based on my 20 years of work in different U.S. government positions, including at the Helsinki Commission, where I cut my teeth with Kyle many years ago, I tried to break down what exactly is religious persecution, because these numbers are so gigantic that they sort of overwhelm the senses. And also, as being in policy positions, to develop effective responses, we need to know what we're talking about. So I identified 4 types of persecution. The first is authoritarian persecution. This is where a government uses the powers of the state to punish or penalize a religious group for what they believe or because they're a competitor in the marketplace of ideas. The second type of persecution is extremist persecution. This is sort of the opposite. This is where non-state actors, people in a community, form mobs to go violently assault others because they're afraid or they disagree with their religious beliefs. The third form is persecution in a democracy. And this is where a large religious community can use its size to transform its beliefs through the ballot box so that it can actually be policed by police, which can lead to persecution. And then the last form is terrorism. This is ISIS, Boko Haram, where individuals are willing to use extreme violence to force their ideology over an entire society. So in the book, I have chapters on each of these, and I have country examples based on my experience. So for example, authoritarian, I look at Burma and China and the genocides that our government have identified against either the Rohingya or the Uyghurs, and talk about efforts that we undertook to try to get them to change their ways. For extremism, I look at the Republic of Georgia, talking about experiences I had when I was here at the commission, as well as Sri Lanka and Pakistan, a country I visited more than any other. And I spent with Pakistan looking at for example, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, or the plight of Asia Bibi, who was a Christian mother sentenced to death for alleged blasphemous activities, and what we tried to do in response. For democracy, I look at the world's largest, India, a country I'm very concerned about how this rising Hindu chauvinism, Hindu nationalism has actually led to the repeated election of Narendra Modi and his party in states across that vast country with dire implications for Indian Muslims, Indian Christians, and others. And then with terrorism, I look at Afghanistan and Iraq. In particular, Iraq, what I was involved in trying to encourage religious minorities had experienced the ISIS onslaught to go back to their ancestral homelands where they felt safe and they felt like they had a future. So understanding the problem is so crucial, especially for you all if you're advising your boss, if you're working on a committee, or if you're an NGO trying to represent your co-religionists, to understand the challenge. And I think it's very important that we use terminology precisely. I've seen time and time again that when well-meaning groups call everything persecution, then it dilutes the word, it harms those who are suffering violence, and frankly, it hurts your own credibility. So when we talk about persecution, it's about violence combined with a lack of any accountability. I mean, here in the United States, bad things can happen to people because a crazy person has some religious animus, but there's a justice system that will hold them to account. So we wouldn't say there's persecution here when something bad happens. But in so many parts of the broken world, there is no accountability. And so things can happen with impunity, and it's that combination of violence and impunity that I think constitutes a situation of religious persecution, and that's how we should use that term. And then I'll start to wrap up. What can we do? So in the book, I talk about the 4 C's: coalitions, consistency, call-outs, and consequences. So first, coalitions. Working to advance freedom of religion or belief for everybody everywhere, building alliances right, left, and center with people of all faiths and none. Of course, here domestically, religious liberty is a hotly contested political issue, but when we're talking about this extreme violence, it's millions and millions of people risk their lives daily for just doing things that we take for granted. That's something that we should all agree is wrong. And building coalitions that span the secular and the religious, that span liberal and conservative, can be powerful in raising the attention to policymakers who can make a difference. On consistency, we make sure we talk about religious freedom with friend and foe alike. I mean, it's really easy to single out Iran, and we should because of the persecution against Baha'is and Christians and others. But administration after administration, regardless of party, Saudi Arabia, the mute button is usually hit. And if we're serious about this, we need to raise it with friend and foe, not out of animus, but because we actually care, because we know that this is going to be in their long-term interests. And with that comes call-outs. The unique ability of the United States, both the State Department, the Religious Freedom Commission, but also individual members of Congress, to highlight abuses, can get the attention of governments, and we can see people released. I mean, the example that Kyle gave of this sign-on letter, it wasn't a terribly heavy lift. It took a couple of weeks of organizing, and we were able to get someone out of jail and change his life for the better. That's a great use of staff time. That's an even better use of intern time. to leverage the influence of your bosses for good, to advance these issues, to help individuals. Now, call-outs can only go so far. I think shining a light's important. So combined with that, we have to get to the last C, consequences. And I truly believe if the United States says religious freedom matters, then it really needs to matter in how we conduct our foreign policy. Otherwise, we're killing our credibility. So if we go far enough to say we're concerned about what's happening in country X, and they don't change their ways, and we do nothing different, then why would they listen to us? They can start to tune us out. And so it's important that we find those points of leverage that we have to restructure the incentives of the powers that be to do something different that they wouldn't otherwise want to do. I talk about in the book what we were able to do with Uzbekistan. It had been designated as a country of particular concern for 15 years or so. And when President Mirziyoyev came in and wanted to turn the page, we saw an opportunity to present sort of carrots and sticks, the red pill, the blue pill. There are two different ways you can go here. Continue to lock up thousands of Muslims, continue to keep churches deregistered, or you can start to liberalize, and we will take you off the list, we'll welcome you back into the family of nations, and they chose that option. Now, Uzbekistan's not where we really want them to be completely, but they're a heck of a lot further along than they were because the United States was able to credibly tell some hard truths and back it up with the threat of consequential action. And so just in wrap up, I think we have a unique opportunity here in Washington, D.C. to leverage all our different nodes of influence to be that voice for the voiceless. I mean, there are literally millions of people every day that risk so much, really risk their lives just to pray how they want, to share their beliefs with others, to educate their children. And I know and I've seen that when the United States speaks up for those people, we can move the needle in ways that no other country can. And Congress is an important voice in that. And I think there's some things we can talk about in the Q&A about what we can do together. So thank you for this opportunity.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is why we invited this gentleman to speak today. You can see why. Knox, are you the only person who made enemies with both India and Pakistan, or are there others too? I appreciate this consistency. If you're going to be critical of a foe, then you have to be willing to do that with a friend as well. So I think just the first question out of the gate is, how do you, I mean, the most difficult one, how do you do that with friends? I mean, India is a huge democracy, incredibly important, especially in this world of competition with China and whatnot. How do we convey that the importance, and then that there are going to be consequences, right? I think that's the part that I think is most difficult. It's one thing just to raise it, but to say, hey, if you don't do this, there could be. What are some of the strategies that you could discuss?
Yeah, India is the country I'm most concerned about because it's been one where there's been a general sort of Washington consensus that Delhi is our counterweight to Beijing because they're a democracy. But policymakers at high level seem unwilling to sort of scratch below the surface of that statement and look at the broader trends across that country underneath the current leadership and how there is a significant drift away from shared values. India is a wonderful country. It's incredibly diverse. It's a birthplace of Buddha, of Hinduism, of Jainism. Christianity was brought there by St. Thomas himself, one of the 12 disciples of Christ. Islam has been there for centuries. Baha'ism, Ahmadiyism, incredible diversity. But this political narrative that it's a Hindu country for Hindus has led to sort of this metastasizing, narrow perspective of what it means to be India with devastating impacts on the Muslim community, on the Christian community, that Narendra Modi seems unwilling to address. And so I think as a friend of India, as a country that does share this foundational belief in democracy and rule of law, having a frank conversation about where they're going is important. It doesn't mean we're slapping sanctions on them, but there are tools like the special watch list that Congress gave the State Department as a way to signal we're concerned where things are going. India, I think, should be on that list. Yeah. And that would get the attention of policymakers in Delhi. That can change the conversation. When I was at the Religious Freedom Commission, then President Obama was going to India, and we had an effort to get to him a letter urging him to raise religious freedom conditions in India. And on his very last day, when he was speaking at the Siri Fort before students, he actually talked about it. And I heard from Indian religious minorities, that improved the climate for at least a year. Oh, wow. Just an American president saying this was important to him. Because what we need to realize is India needs us more than we need them. We're the superpower. They're the one that has China on their border. And so for us to come up as sort of supplicants that we're so desperate to have this relationship, we'll ignore all the bad things that are happening, I think kind of puts an imbalance in the relationship that's unhelpful and unhealthy. So I think being honest, representing our values, and it's up to them to decide whether they want to come towards these shared values, or if they're going a different path, they're a free country and they can do that, but then there'll be consequences with how this relationship will look.
Yeah. Knox, one of the other questions that I had is, I think people who are in this foreign policy space know some of the hot spots, but what are the countries or places, doesn't have to be, that you think are underreported, that people are not talking about, that we as folks on a Hill should be paying attention to, or maybe getting ahead a little bit of that trend to sort of not to react to violence like we saw in Myanmar, but maybe get ahead of it and prevent something? What are some of the places that you can think of? If not, we can go back to it. But
I think it's not so much a place, it's a topic. Migration is front and center of every major industrial power these days. I think there's a lack of appreciation of the role of religious persecution in forcing people to hit the road. If you're worried that you're going to be murdered when you go to church or mosque, or your children are going to be kidnapped and forcibly converted, I would run for my life. I would take my family and go wherever I could. And so addressing the drivers of persecution can address one of the drivers of this migration phenomenon that we're seeing impacting every country in the world. And I think that element is overlooked, the human rights, religious freedom component of the migration challenge. And so if we can look beyond what's happening at our borders, we have to, of course, focus on that. But what are the push factors and try to address them, that can also help stem the flow that's been such a problem.
yeah. And the last question from me, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Please feel free to come up and ask. One of the other things that I've been wondering is how technology and surveillance, contemporary, what kind of an impact does it have on religious freedom? And obviously, some obvious examples are, Xinjiang, China, but is it happening other places? Are there some of the things that we need to be thinking about now? There's obviously enthusiasm about AI and everything else, but does it have an impact? I would assume, just like it does on everything else in life. What kind of a specific impact, or what's the best way to think about it? Technology and surveillance.
On the technology side, I think it's this question of how are social media platforms and texting platforms used, and the responsibility of these corporations to govern, manage, moderate their sites. I've seen examples of where in Sri Lanka, Facebook platforms were used where hate groups would put stuff in Sinhala that no one knew how to read wherever Facebook minders were located, that led to attacks on a Muslim village and deaths. So I think there needs to be a conversation with these corporations about how their platforms are used, because they're often, WhatsApp groups, another great example in Pakistan, where mobs will be formed over allegations of blasphemy and people will die. So bringing corporations into the conversation with the government about their responsibilities, I don't think we can let them say, we just put it out there, it's none of our business. Well, if people are being assaulted because of your tools, then we need to have a conversation about what that looks like. On the AI side, I think this machine learning, this spreading of the Chinese technological web to other countries is really alarming. I think this sort of bipartisan consensus that Chinese tech should be suspect is smart. But then how do we work with these governments when they say, well, this Huawei stuff is really cheap? We need 3G, at least, if not 5G. How do we partner with them to give them another tool that's not going to be used for oppression? So that quickly spiderwebs into broader issues, but there is a religious freedom and human rights component to that conversation.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone, please? Ray, if you, just so we can record, do you mind coming up to the microphone right there?
Ray Celeste with Congressman Dr. Murphy. It has been brought to Congressman Dr. Murphy's attention that in Ukraine that they have adopted legislation that will ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is Ukraine's, as you probably know, sir, the largest Christian denomination. And this is called Law 3894, and it will terminate the legal identity and property rights of the church and outlaw its religious activities. Would you care to comment on this situation?
So as I understand the way the law is written, we're ending the sort of 9-month grace period since its passage for churches and religious groups to disaffiliate with the Moscow Patriarch affiliated Ukrainian Orthodox Church. When I looked at the law, I thought, while I didn't think it was necessary, that they had other tools on the books to address these real concerns of Russian agents wearing a religious garb, doing nefarious activities inside the borders of Ukraine. I think the structure is one that does have a series of checks. There'll be judicial review, there'll be evaluation. So it's not like they're kicked out immediately. There's an opportunity for a rule of law process to occur. So I think we're at the point now where we'll see how this plays out. And this is where those who consider themselves friends of Ukraine can have those conversations and say, look, we're concerned. We of course don't want Russian KGB agents, FSB agents dressed up like priests running around and sharing targeting information. But there are millions of your fellow citizens that belong to this church, and we need to find a way to accommodate their beliefs and ability to worship as they feel led. But I think, Ukraine is this incredibly unique situation of where you do have, active hostilities going on, and the Russian Orthodox Church based in Moscow is dominated by Vladimir Putin, and we can't ignore that fact. And so how does that play out at the parish level is incredibly complicated. And I worry that as that information gets sort of passed along all the way over here, it gets diluted or misinterpreted as like a bad game of telephone. And so we just have to be very careful that we're getting accurate information now that this grace period has ended and see how it plays out.
Anyone else? Any questions? Please.
Okay, I believe this is on?
Yes.
Awesome. So my name is JP. I am with the Helsinki Commission for the summer, actually. And in some of the same vein as the questions you've got already, I am curious how you would approach this question of a phenomenon that I think is well observed in the post-Soviet space, in the long shadow of imperial and ideological collapse of states like Armenia, for example, coming into conflict with state churches, which they believe to be operating as agents of foreign influence or as agents which are hostile to democratic development or westward alignment. And with this in mind, and bearing in mind especially these legitimate concerns, how would you propose that these states address the legacy of empire and of communism in a way which respects the rights and dignities of religious organizations and religious institutions which do have long-standing histories in those countries or are brand new?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's, a couple different elements to that. One is in the former Soviet space, just the revival of religious life after the imposed atheism. As bad as Russia is right now on religious freedom issues, it's a heck of a lot better than it was during the Soviet period. That's not saying much, but that's still true. And so, the interest of these, the Soviet republics as it became nations to establish their identity with faith is a huge component of that. Makes sense that it wanted to elevate, favor, help reestablish the traditional Orthodox Church, the traditional Islamic faith. The challenge has been from a human rights and religious freedom perspective, if they're only allowed to have one faith. And international standards, OSCE standards don't prohibit the establishment of official church or official faith, as long as other faiths aren't penalized or criminalized for also existing. So you can sort of compare, United Kingdom, King Charles is the head of the Church of England, but there's great religiosity, great religious diversity in that OSCE member, compared against, like Saudi Arabia, where there's only one form of Islam allowed to be practiced and all others are banned, and of course there's no church. So creating that legal environment where that allows groups to register and have legal identity is important. And I think this is one of the unique things about the OSCE region is you have a lot of different registration systems that have been established that are supposed to enhance the free practice of faith, but often are applied in such a way to limit it. And the OSCE has some really fabulous, groundbreaking standards on that and analysis on that through the panel of experts. But you have everything from like Slovakia, which requires, if you want to form a new church, if we wanted to form a new religious community, we need to get signatures from 50,000 other people. Okay, that's discriminatory. It's not persecution, but it's discriminatory. It sets, winners and losers. Or Hungary, you need to have 2/3 of the parliament vote approve the establishment of a new faith community. Or you look at the former Central Asia, there the numbers are lower, but there's all these sort of opt-out clauses that make it virtually impossible for new Muslim groups or non-Muslim groups to establish. I think those are the challenges in this sort of post-colonial, post-Soviet space of establishing firm protections for religious freedom. And actually, they're established, seeing them applied and lived out on the ground.
Thank you. And I'm just going to stand right here to help people with the mic if they've got questions.
Please.
Hello, my name is Stepan, intern for Congressman Joe Wilson, and and I'm from Ukraine. And during the Russo-Ukrainian War, among the war crimes that Russia committed in Ukraine, we saw specific targeting of Ukrainian Catholics and Ukrainian evangelical communities. And professors like Timothy Snyder and Eugene Finkel said it constitutes the genocide of the Ukrainian nation. And I'm wondering what would be, the clear ways to communicate to the broader American audience about, the war crimes and persecutions of religious minorities in the occupied territory by Russia in Ukraine, to prove what you started with, that a matter of religious freedoms is not something historic, but a contemporary problem that people in Europe struggle with. Thank you.
I had the great privilege to meet with a group of Ukrainian Protestant pastors who happened to be in town the day that President Zelensky met President Trump in the Oval Office. It was just happenstance. But they talked about what's happening in the occupied territories, and when these pastors are taken to the basement was sort of the euphemism for being disappeared and murdered. And they were here to tell that story, both to their fellow Baptists and Adventists and Pentecostals, which I think is important, that this, at the relational level, gets out to the broader American public so that they can then share it with their members of Congress. But I think there's also an important opportunity with the State Department having its annual report on international religious freedom coming out, and then the designations on countries of particular concern. Will Russia be maintained as a CPC? Will the justifications include what's happening in the occupied territories? That's another way to signal both to Vladimir Putin, but also the broader world that this is part of the Ruski Mir effort to erase Ukraine by killing, literally, and destroying these examples of a different type of Christianity than what they'd prefer to see.
Thank you so much for your comment. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Bauman. I'm a policy advisor at the Helsinki Commission. I agree with you that the terminology that we use around religious persecution is very important, and that we shouldn't waste heavy words like persecution on, things that are not violence plus impunity. My question is broader. What should we do about things that fall below that threshold? What kind of things are there that are sort of in that in-between space? What should we call them, and how should we address them?
Yeah. Well, I think this is where, especially for colleagues at the Helsinki Commission, you have these, like I was saying, very elaborate OSCE standards on freedom of religion or belief that are way more developed than what you see at the United Nations level. They go beyond it. And every country theoretically has a political commitment to these. And so when you get to an issue of like registration, it was interesting, the previous UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, he made this really interesting statement that it's registration systems that lead to the greatest number of religious freedom violations globally. And it's not exciting, it's not, news headline breaking, but it's this sort of daily grind that we're going to use sort of lawfare to prevent you from having a status as a faith community, and then everything else you want to do that's recognized by international law, we're saying is criminal or illegal. And this is where I think the commission, where staffers can have that sort of smaller conversation with embassies here, through your members writing letters to heads of state saying, we've heard about community X being deregistered or being denied registration. Your law does not comport with OSCE standards or United Nations standards, and we urge you to amend the law, register the group. And from my time here, I saw that work. It didn't work all the time, but it often worked because, especially in the small and medium-sized countries, if they get a letter from a member of Congress, or if they get a letter from members of Congress, that carries some weight. And that'll get the attention in a way that, a small, struggling NGO religious community can't. So you can be a force multiplier by developing those relationships. And this is where I would encourage the advocacy community to really work with Hill staff and commission staff to give really tight information, the who, what, where, when, and why, a 2-pager front and back with a very clean policy ask, and be sure your facts are right. I mean, you referenced our friends from the Jehovah's Witnesses. My first book, which is sort of a handbook on how to do religious freedom advocacy, was inspired by my time at the commission because the Jehovah's Witnesses do a fabulous job of just giving you really tight information that's actionable, that they've experienced and seen, and I learned to trust that. And my fellow Baptists, they'd give me a 20-page, single-page document written in Russian, which I don't read, and say, please help. And I wanted to help, but I didn't. And so the more you can make it easier for these very busy staffers, very busy members of Congress, very busy policy analysts to understand the issue and give them a route forward, you're going to see gains. And so I would encourage you, of course, to focus on the violent persecution because it's life and death, but there's this level below that is still problematic, the discrimination, the limitations that I think are worthy of attention. And you all have the ability and your position to have that in a way that few others can.
Any other questions? If not, Knox, I'm just going to go ahead and ask this one question. It's wonky. Totally, I will admit it. Oh, there's a question. There's a question. I'm sorry. Please go ahead. It's better than my wonky question. Please.
Hi, my name is Katie. I'm with Representative DeLuzio's office from Pennsylvania's 17th District, and I'm also a fellow with J Street, if you're familiar at all. I was just curious about your U.S.-Israel foreign policy, and because Israel has a lot of religious minorities within the state and then also within Gaza and the West Bank, do you see that from do you see any situations arising there through a religious persecution angle, or things with Gaza and humanitarian aid? Is there any, framework you have for looking at those situations?
So when I was at the State Department, my last job, I visited Israel twice, and there's sort of two categories. There's sort of inside the 1967 borders of Israel, there are issues that are religious freedom issues along discrimination, limitation, registration questions that feel the things I was encountering when I was at Helsinki Commission, sort of European challenges of minority groups not being accepted by the community and then having legal problems. So there's that challenge. And then you get into the West Bank and Gaza, and that's just a whole nother thing. Religion is, of course, part of the conflict. It's not everything, but it's certainly there. I've never viewed it as a religious freedom challenge, so it hasn't been something that I've actively engaged on. It was more on the other side of the line where I've focused.
Thank you. And I also have a second question. For us, I know you kind of just asked this, but is there any current things circulating that we can get our bosses to sign on? How can we be in the know with that stuff?
So one of the things, this is something I've been starting to study, is what's happening in the Western Hemisphere, actually. We've been blessed in that in our hemisphere, there are no Chinas, there are no Burmas, no Saudi Arabias, that there is generally religious freedom. with the exceptions of Cuba, Nicaragua, and increasingly Venezuela. But this emerging challenge is also the impact of criminal networks and cartels on religious communities, and where pastors and priests are like the voice of their community. They're a source of hope and goodness, and cartels hate that. And so we see pastors and church workers increasingly attacked, disappeared. And so working with the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, we're working on a letter to the President of Colombia because there were recently 7 church workers who were disappeared by a FARC splinter group and murdered. And there is something the Colombian government can do. They had this, it's complicated, but they had a system that listed protected groups, and religious leaders, religious communities were listed, but 2 years ago that was removed. And so they're no longer eligible for state protection. And so we think that the murder of these church workers and another Catholic priest was just disappeared is the sad hook to go back to the president and say, you need to fix this. You should at least add them back to this list of protected groups. I'm not sure it would save these poor people, but it might save others. And that's something where a congressional voice is really, really helpful.
And what's that called?
It's I can, if we give you my card later,
Okay,
I can
thanks.
send it to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Nathan Worcester, reporter with the Epoch Times. I'm wondering, and this is very much in the headlines with the bombing in Syria by Israel in the name of the Druze religious minority. We also had the recent church bombing on the 22nd of June, Alawite persecution in Syria. It seems to me that the predicate for a lot of U.S. and Western policy on Syria under Assad was religious persecution. At this point, things are obviously changing, but how would you assess religious freedom in Syria now as compared to under the previous regime?
Well, there's a previous regime before and during the Civil War. Before the Civil War, issues of religious freedom didn't really come up very much. After the Civil War, when the whole country was falling apart, as state control withered, you saw that these jihadi groups, these terrorist groups, were victimizing Christians, Alawites, Druze. And now with the new leadership, I think this is it's an open question about where Syria is going to go on these issues. I think the new constitution will have wording talking about historic communities have the right to freedom of worship. There's no way it's going to have any reference to full religious freedom standards about freedom to have any faith or none or change faith. There's no way that'll be included just based on the background of al-Shura and his coterie of followers. So you have that legal process that's going to be unfolding. What's that mean? We've already seen problematic changes to textbooks that are removing images of women that don't wear a scarf, removing references to non-Sunni religious groups that are part of Syria's history. That's not going in the right direction. And then you have the violence. You have, before your examples, you also had the violence in Latakia against the Alawite community that was just astounding. And then you also have the autonomous region in the northeast, which is run by a Kurdish affiliation with Christians and Yazidis. So there's a long way before Syria returns to any type of normalcy. And I think this is where the U.S., working with our allies, needs to have a conditional response. That it's, yes, we want Syria to return to the family of nations and Syrians to be able to go home in a place where they can have dignity, respect, and human rights. But if you're going to become a place of radicalism and violence and victimization of minorities, then we're not going to reward you for that by instead of having some type of snapback function to the sanctions that the president reduced. I think would be wise, because I'm deeply concerned where the new government is going and what they can even do.
Thank you.
Please.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mia Nash. I'm working here as a Girl Scout congressional aide, and I was just wondering, with your time in the State Department, did you notice any departments or organizations or groups that you think inside the State Department or outside that you think are particularly suited to deal with this issue and to raise more advocacy for it and to carry out your 4Cs?
So one of the encouraging things, I mean, the challenge of persecution is not going away anytime soon. But in the 20 years, almost 25 years now I've been in this space, we are seeing sort of new efforts to build these coalitions. There's the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, which brings groups together of all faiths and none. They couldn't agree theologically on the time of day, but they believe in human dignity, and that people shouldn't be discriminated against or certainly hurt for what they believe. And so they're acting together in that. That's a good news story. There's also now the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion and Belief. This is something for the staffers here, your bosses should get involved in, ippforb.org. It's a network of elected officials in parliaments around the world committed to religious freedom for everybody. Again, right, left, and center, different backgrounds, beliefs, regions. Again, maybe wouldn't agree on tax policy, but agree in human dignity and the rights of people to have freedom of conscience. That's a good news story. And then there's also now the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance of countries that's now over 40, including the United States, that's trying to bring governments together around this shared belief in human dignity and religious freedom. So these are positive things. These are the coalitions. Now the challenge is leveraging the coalitions to action. And I've been involved in creating all three of these over the years. And the NGOs, they're the engine, right? They've got the energy, the time. They're connected most closely to the group. So you want to get that information, try to harness that energy. Congressmen, members of parliament, they're the ones that can then take that and act on their own, but also challenge their governments to do more. And then governments move the slowest, but they also have the power. And so having all three of these groups working together can hopefully start to produce gains that we haven't seen. And then sort of the last part is the faith leaders. If you get faith leaders talking about religious freedom for everyone, even if they, while you hold your own truths very closely and you wish others would hold them too, you recognize that it's a fundamental human right just to pursue truth as your conscience leads. If you have faith leaders enunciating that, that's the game changer. And that's the part we haven't seen yet consistently, because their voice can carry so much further than governments or elected officials. And if we can get all four legs of this advocacy stool engaged and at a high level, then I think we can really start to help people in durable, lasting ways.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Anyone else? Any other questions? At any point you want to, we have another 10 minutes or so. Let me ask you one question, and then I know, I think Kyle, I think you might want to, I think you had some questions too. I had a wonky question, I had a childish question. I'll go for the childish one. If you were US president, what are the top 2 or 3 things that you would do immediately? You talked about you as being the leader, you as being the power, really the global power when it comes to religious freedom. What are the top 2, 3 things you would do immediately to advance this agenda?
Kyle Parker would either be ambassador to Russia or Secretary of State. I'd let you pick. Ambassador to Ukraine. Okay, there we go. Right.
Fair enough.
What would I do? I think it's just this making sure that our values are informing our interests. That to separate the two, if we only pursue what we understand to be our interests, those change, those aren't lasting, those aren't eternal. And so we'll be swinging left and right between administrations, between presidents. And so making sure our values are intertwined in how we're conducting our foreign policy will lead to a more stable foreign policy. We'll be able to drive things consistently longer, and that can start to see our country use these incredible blessings of prosperity and liberty that we have to see other countries also benefit from that. And that's in our interest, because then they won't be the drivers of terrorism or extremism or migration. So I would just try to reiterate that and embed that as a core part of our foreign policy. So the Secretary of State who worked for me would know there's not a human rights ambassador or religious freedom ambassador. That's your job.
Yeah. Excellent. Perfect. Thank you. Kyle, I think you might. If anyone else, no one has any questions, I know Kyle, you do.
Knox, I appreciate your very practical focus here. I've always struggled on the practical side of things. So I'd like to engage perhaps some of your the more theoretical or philosophical parts of your expertise here. And I think some of these are related, some of these are not related. The one I think that's not related, we'll just throw out there first, anti-Semitism. When you were at the commission, you worked also extensively on anti-Semitism. I tend to view anti-Semitism I don't see anti-Semitism as predominantly a problem of religious freedom. It seems to me that it gets into other things. It's the world's oldest conspiracy theory. But clearly, being Jewish is a faith. How do you see it, and what part of anti-Semitism resides in the religious freedom realm, and what part might not?
I think if
And is there any practical effect in the way we combat it?
Yeah. How it connects to religious freedom is if, because of anti-Semitism being expressed in a community either through violence or slurs or graffiti, that can hinder or limit the ability of Jews to practice their faith, to feel like they can go to synagogue, to wear the yarmulke. And so there are clear implications of religious freedom when there is anti-Semitism in a community. But I agree that it's a interconnected, related, but also unique because of the drivers behind it and its ancient disease that dates back 2 millennia now. But there are, absolute intersections with religious freedom issues.
Interesting, great points. And I think this is probably one of the reasons that, at least in the OSCE context with the special reps, that the United States has consistently emphasized the importance of retaining a special rep on anti-Semitism and not folding it into Islamophobia, discrimination against Christians and other things. Another question I have, and again, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of practical consequence, but am I correct in seeing and understanding? I mean, religious freedom to me seems to be the most intimate of freedoms. It seems to be the most fundamental freedoms. It seems to be a freedom from which other freedoms are given birth. And I feel like it's no accident that it resides in the First Amendment, right? And when I was thinking about that the other day, I'm like, well, geez, they didn't think of this when they just wrote the Constitution. They actually had to amend it in. How fundamental could it be? And you say, well, it's also kind of there in the preamble, and it colors the whole founding. But I look at it as and I think it's clear when you look at it as freedom of religion, thought, conscience, and belief. That if we're not free in this space here, right, the cranial orbit or whatever, one first thinks here and then decides to act externally in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and all these other things. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I've referred to it, religious freedom, as the soul of the human rights regime.
The soul of the human rights regime.
Because everything comes from it. Like, why do you want to have rights to assemble? Well, there's
the human rights government, not the regime.
Well, the human rights
kidding.
system. Oh, right. But like, why do you want to assemble? What's motivating you? Why do you want to have free speech? Why do you want to have freedom of movement? Like, there are things that you believe that are motivating you that are protected by Article 18 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and the Vienna concluding document in the OSCE context. And so it's the soul of the system. If you don't have religious freedom, then the things that animate the reasons people want these other rights is missing.
I like that, the soul of the human rights regime. Never heard it before, and we'll use it now and give credit where credit is due. So we go through different political moments, right? So we're going through one now that's different from where we were last year, right? Things wax and wane, and it seems like, and I've seen in my couple decades in the human rights world, where certain freedoms or certain causes tend to be elevated or more favored, and others kind of, less emphasized. I'm of the belief that one can advance the good wherever the good is to be found, without infringing on any other good, and hopefully advancing that good, if it generally is good and you are advancing it, benefits others, benefits other rights? Do you see a knock-on effect with saying, hey, we're going to spend a lot of time, our new administration has certainly spoken about religious freedom, has raised it in international fora. Am I correct in thinking that progress in the realm of religious freedom will benefit a whole host of other fundamental freedoms?
We like to talk about religious freedom as the canary in the coal mine for the broader health of a human rights environment, because it's a multifaceted human right. It's unique among other human rights that have been enunciated in that for religious freedom to be fully protected and respected, by definition, other rights have to be respected as well. So if you think about it, if you go to church, mosque, synagogue, temple on your holy day, all the rights that have to be exercised. So of course you have freedom of belief. You go to the place of worship, you have freedom of worship, but there's also going to be a desire to have freedom of speech, to deliver the message, freedom of expression, to wear distinctive religious dress, freedom of movement, to get to the place. Then there's a question of property rights and incorporation so that the religious community can have legal standing, legal personality to own property, so property rights become incorporated in this. So it's when you get religious freedom right, by definition, these other rights are being enjoyed as well. And when religious freedom is limited, then by definition, something along this list is unhealthy. And so it's a helpful barometer for the overall health of a human rights environment in a country of interest.
So my final, thank you for that. My final question is perhaps closer to home. When we were, and it relates to religion in the public square. So when we were scoping out this briefing, we were looking at various framings and what we would focus on, and of course you began to focus on persecution, and let's use our terminology correctly, let's prioritize, if somebody's getting killed or tortured, we need to address that before we can address other problems that I think perhaps reside in liberal democracies where religious freedom is concerned. So on the one hand, you look the spectrum of autocracy, authoritarianism, and you've got places where, state-enforced atheism, North Korea, right? Yeah. Or you have Iran, right? A theocracy, one particular religion, one particular interpretation. And then you have some illiberal democracies as you move across the continuum where one might say that religious freedom is either reduced or instrumentalized, or perhaps certain groups favored, certain state functions co-opted. But then you get over to the other side of the spectrum, liberal democracies, maybe very liberal democracies, certain parts of Europe. I just called up a story from February following the vice president's speech at Munich. J.D. Vance decried extremist over attack on UK abortion clinic safe zones, right? And his remarks here, right, he says at the Munich Security Conference that the UK had placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in the crosshairs, citing the prosecution of Adam Smith Connor, a physiotherapist and Army veteran. Vance said he had been charged with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes, not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. So I guess my question here is, you also remind me that OSCE commitments can be read with profit. I'm thinking of, I think, the Toledo Guiding Principles, which I thought were rather ingenious in the sense that they solved for me the problem of saying, we're not asking you to respect someone else's religion, right? You might be a believer and say, I don't, or a non-believer. I don't respect that. I think it's superstitious nonsense. Or I don't respect your religion. I think it's heretical, or it begets violence. But I can respect your human freedom, right? Your freedom to believe it. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are where you have liberal democracies, which in some senses where religion has become a cultural artifact, where it's been reduced to a Christmas market, right, or a parade, or something. Again, more ethnic churches, things that are less guiding and have less practical effect in the public square. You're free to be religious as long as your religion has no practical effect in the public square. What in these situations is the ask that religion merely be tolerated in the public square? Should it be welcomed in the public square? I believe it should be welcomed in the public. I actually believe it's essential to a vibrant public square. But I'm wondering what we can say, and sort of by way of commitments, how this is addressed. You go from tolerated to welcome to essential.
Yeah, I think that is the question that Western Europe is grappling with now, as sort of the traditional Christian communities have become more and more secular, and participation in Christian religious life has, sometimes dwindled to sort of a Christmas and Easter exercise. Well, you have these new communities that are predominantly Muslim that are devout and that do hold the faith closely. And there's this tension of how do you manage that, and they're struggling with it. To prepare for this briefing, I was reading through the reports of the UN Special Rapporteur on Religious Freedom, because she has two reports, one on Sweden and one on Hungary. And they address some of these questions. And she had this great phrase where she talked about, I think it was in Sweden, that they have an impoverished understanding of freedom of religion or belief, because they see it as like inherently private. And international standards are clear that, you're asking, can it be in the public square, where it's wherever people are. And if they're in the public square, they can bring their faith, and they can talk about their faith, and they can share their faith, and they can change their faith. That is bedrock international human rights law and OSCE commitments. So at a certain level, it's this societal question where people don't know how to deal with it. And, tolerance, tolerating something has a negative vibe, but in a lot of countries around the world, if we can get to toleration, that's a win. But I think it's a question in Europe, sort of post-religious Europe, how do we help revive an understanding that faith actors can be a social good? They are a social good, and the benefits they bring. And yes, there'll be issues that there'll be disagreement about, but that's what a democratic society creates space for. And you can't exclude them based on their religious beliefs, because then that's a religious freedom violation. So it's going to be an ongoing conversation, but I would commend those two reports to everyone to see how she's grappling with this very question.
Okay, I appreciate that, Knox. Do you have any concluding remarks?
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to come back to the commission after so many years and remember the ways that this body has been so important in advancing human rights, religious freedom, speaking up for those that don't have a voice across the OSCE region. And your work with Mr. Magnitsky and that effort, I think, is another testament to the legacy of the commission and its leadership and its members. And so we should just be, always find ways to recommit ourselves to this. The forces of oppression, they don't sleep. And if we're committed to human rights, if we're committed to religious freedom, we can't either. And that's hard, but we've got to find ways to challenge our own government, challenge ourselves, challenge our elected leaders to carry this unique American commitment forward in every venue and every way possible. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about these things.
Well, thank you, Knox. Your commitment is inspiring, and I have no doubt that it will galvanize our focus going forward on this particular this soul of the human rights regime. Really appreciate your eloquence and remarks today, and I thank you all. It was great to have a robust question and answer period. Sometimes you give the talk and then there's one or two questions, but I think we really had a good exchange today. So I appreciate you all for coming. This will become part of a permanent U.S. government transcript. Remarks are online. They will be printed, and so you can find that at csce.gov. Thank you all. With that, we're adjourned.
Thank you so much, Knox. Join me in a round of applause.
And I'm remiss, I should recognize Bhakti, and thank you, Bhakti, for moderating the panel.